welcome to Life of Die, the podcast which discusses all things to do with tabletop wargaming and role-playing games. My name is Gordon and I'm joined today by Craig, Chris and Bob. And this is the first of our podcasts. We'll be introducing ourselves and we'll be discussing our background and history with tabletop gaming and also discovering why we love role-playing and wargaming. So as your regular host, I'll get the ball rolling. So my background with gaming probably goes back to the age of 2 because at that point I went to see Star Wars in the cinema and I was just obsessed with Star Wars after that, and it's something I've loved throughout my life ever since, and played quite a lot of Star Wars role playing as well throughout the years. But 10 years later I then discovered 2000 AD, which was a British comics which featured the character of Judge Dredd, who you might know from the Stone film and also the Carl Urban version, which was much better. Because I liked those characters so much, I spotted in an old Virgin Mega store at the time that they had a game for Judge Dredd, and it was a Judge Dredd role-playing game, which was by Games Workshop. I had no concept of what a role-playing game was at that point, but I bought it on a whim just because I was a Judge Dredd fan, and I thought, a game about Judge Dredd, that sounds cool. So yeah, when I got it home and picked it up, I started reading the rules. The rules were, at that point to me, felt quite complicated, but when I read them these days, they're pretty straightforward, to be honest. It's a percentage system, and you just roll. As long as you get less than or equal to your actual skill, then you've passed, and it really is as simple as that. But at the time it seemed quite complicated, but I just bought into it straight away because I loved Dredd so much. I had some friends that were Dredd fans as well, and so there was a couple of us. The weekends we would meet up, and I would run the scenarios from the Judge Dredd game, and then quite quickly I started writing my own scenarios for it. And again, running the games for friends, and it was a lot of fun. And through that, because that was when I discovered about who Games Workshop were, and quickly after I picked up the Blockmania board game, which has just been re-released by Rebellion Unplugged. Rebellion on 2000 AD. It was back then again another Games Workshop game because they had the license to Judge Dredd at that point. So I had a lot of fun with that as well, but that was more a board game. And then started buying White Dwarf, and at that point they were just talking about Warhammer 40,000 first edition coming out in a few months, and I remember myself and a group of other friends bought the Warhammer 40,000 first edition book. We had a few games of that. We liked it, but we didn't love it. We didn't engage with it the same way that we did with the Dredd game. I think just because it was a totally different thing to the wargaming at that point. And we were much more involved with the role playing. But then, in a couple of years after that, I picked up what was Adeptus Titanicus at the time, first edition, and then Space Marine first edition, and that introduced me to epic wargaming, which is Warhammer 40,000, except in 6mm scale. And there was just something about that. I remember when I bought Adeptus Titanicus that when I looked at the box art, it just really captured my imagination because it was showing you these huge war machines, and the Marines were absolutely tiny at their feet. And when I saw those pictures of the Titans, and box art actually had some of the prototypes of the original 6mm Marines, and some of the Land Raider tanks, and I just thought that just kind of worked for me a lot better than 40,000, because I felt 40,000, what I was playing back then, were very much small skirmishes, and epic kind of felt like, you can have a full scale battle with this. I just became obsessed with epic once that was out, particularly second edition. I remember when second edition came out, initially I was quite shocked because it took out. Epic used to take like a whole weekend, the first edition Epic. When we used to play that, it would take an entire weekend of our to play the game. And when second edition came out, it then brought the game down to a manageable scale, where you can play it in a couple of hours. It still takes an entire afternoon, in all likelihood, and it can take longer if it depending on the size of game that you're playing. But yeah, that's been a real favourite game of mine throughout my life since I discovered it. Around about the same time as Epic, I also my brother got Space Hulk, and that was first edition, and he got the upgrades, the supplements rather, Deathwing and Gene Stealer, and yeah, we loved that game a lot. We didn't like the Gene Stealer Psychic rules that much, but I think I'd quite like to play that again and see what they were like. Just because it made the Psychers really powerful, and it made a lot of the other characters not really, they weren't really involved anymore. But yeah, we played a lot of Space Hulk, so yeah, I love that game as well. Later on in my probably into my early 20s, I think, or late teens maybe, I started running Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and that was quite a liberating experience after having written Judge Dredd scenarios. The reason being, when you write Judge Dredd, there's a lot of crime files, and there's a lot of kind of detail that you've got to put into the game for the puzzles for the players to solve. So there's a lot of work involved in writing Judge Dredd. Whereas when I started playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I just felt, yeah, you still need to create the NPC characters, but it just felt like that so much of the work wasn't there. You just needed to have a few maps to hand, and you could get away with what I would describe as murder at the time. I couldn't believe how, I could turn up at a session and have maybe like a page written, and that would be enough for the whole night. So some of that was kind of winging it aspect to that, but with a fantasy setting, I really thought you could get away with quite a lot. And then went back into science fiction, and I played, GM'd Cyberpunk 2020, which is the basis of the new Cyberpunk 2070 game that's just come out on for the new gaming consoles, attracting a lot of comment. The original RPG, I had a really great time running that particular game, because I set it in my hometown of Glasgow, and so I had a street map of Glasgow which I just slapped down in front of the players, and everybody knew the setting that I was putting in. It was just imagining Glasgow as it is now, except looking like this, like Blade Runner, looking like Blade Runner, which in fairness Glasgow does look a bit like that sometimes with the rain, but more neon and more skyscrapers, which we don't really have that here. And that was great fun running that, because I think that was the first time I'd run something that was like really adult and really gritty, and there was a lot of nastiness in the game, and one of the players really got involved with the game, that he started telling me what he was doing between sessions, and it ended up, that was part of the reason I found that game so much fun, was because we ended up making up a lot of story, additional stuff, because of what he was up to in the game, and the players just thought this was all stuff I was putting in, and it wasn't. It was all stuff he was getting up to. So that was a really enjoyable experience, because I had a player that was like interacting so much with like what I was creating. So that was great fun. As a player, I played GURPS briefly. That was a friend was running he was running Terminator using the GURPS system. So it was all set after Judgment Day, and Skynet was essentially in charge. Now, this was at the time when Terminator 2 was probably only a couple of years old, so they hadn't seen anything like Salvation, but essentially it was like Terminator Salvation, if you've ever seen that. It was all about the humans fighting against the robots and their factories and all that kind of thing, so that was good fun as well. And I had a bit of a hiatus on my gaming, in my probably between, I'd say probably my mid-20s to my mid-30s. During that time I was doing a bit of online gaming, and yeah, computer games for a while. I was definitely quite involved with it. I remember when I got the Xbox 360, I was particularly into Elder Scrolls Oblivion and Gears of War. They were two of the games that I was just spending ridiculous hours playing all the time. But I came back to gaming, get back into Epic again, and then met most of the people that are on this podcast joining me with me. And since then, I started playing Cyberpunk 2020 again, and then that didn't last very long, and then moved back into Star Wars D6, which I'd played as a player in my teens. Somebody else, one of my friends, had been game master back then, but yeah, we had a group. I think it was there was seven players and myself running it as GM, and that ran for over 50 sessions. That version of that particular version of Star Wars D6, and also get into X-Wing Miniatures game, and since then I've also played Strontium Dog Miniatures game, which is by Warlord, and Game of Thrones board game, Core Space, which is it's a tabletop board game slash, yeah, is it a war game? I'm not sure it is. It's halfway between a war game and a role playing game, I would say. And more recently, I've played as a player the Alien RPG, and recently I've went full circle, and I'm now GMing as part of my GM for Hire service. I'm running Judge Dredd again with the old Games Workshop system, and I'm writing all the scenarios from scratch. I'd lost all the games I'd written as a teenager, and to be honest, I don't think they would have stood up that well because I was thinking about them. Yeah, I think my storytelling's came on a wee bit since then. So, yeah, that kind of brings me up to date. That's my history with role playing and wargaming. So I think I'll throw it out to one of the guys. So, Craig, what about yourself? How did you get into role playing and wargaming? What's your history with the hobby?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. I think for my experience was probably a bit of similar type to yours, Gordon. But I've got a brother who's 10 years older than me, so it was really just whatever he brought home was what I got to see of the wargaming world. So initially, I think he came home with a small selection of 40k or Rogue Trader miniatures as they were at the time, and a little bit of the Warhammer Fantasy Battle stuff as well. And I think he played some of the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay as well with his friends from school. And then around about kind of 89, 90, he brought home a couple of the plastic Warlord Titans from the Adeptus Titanicus box, and a metal Reaver Titan, and that was kind of piqued my interest, certainly, seeing the big stompy robots, and I think the kind of scale of that appealed to both of us, and that was really the first. I think it wasn't until later on we actually got the box set for second edition Space Marine when it came out, which I think was maybe 92, which came with like 3 starter armies and kind of a lot of content for the box, all the buildings and things as well, and that really got us started. Again, we were kind of limited in what we had collections wise, a few armies of maybe a couple of thousand points each, but it was really enough to kind of get it going, get a good few games in, and played that for maybe 4 or 5 years up until the release of third edition. And at that point, it was a kind of natural stopping point. He was off to uni, and I was kind of losing interest in it a little bit. During that period as well, I played a bit of Space Crusade, which was a Milton Bradley board game released at about the same time as Hero Quest, which was the kind of fantasy equivalent. And it was a good introduction again to the kind of 40k miniatures universe, and it gave you a good bundle of, albeit kind of monopose miniatures to play with and paint. So that was good fun. Aside from that, I had a couple of friends at school who were kind of getting into it in their own way as well. They humoured me by playing Epic, but they were more interested in the kind of 28mm stuff, and the kind of more artistic amongst them were getting into painting and stuff, miniatures. So yeah, I played a little bit of second edition 40k when it first came out, and later on, kind of 95, Necromunda came out, which was the kind of skirmish gang fighting game set in the 40k universe, but it was more kind of a bit more gritty, a bit more kind of Judge Dredd like. Played a little bit of that, which was good fun. I always kind of wanted to get back into that one as well. And then had a bit of a hiatus for, I don't know, maybe 10 years, till I was kind of late teens, early 20s maybe. And throughout the time I kind of kept up with things. I was always, if I was stopping in a newsagents, I'd have a flick through a White Dwarf or whatever, and occasionally I'd get a kind of, maybe in my kind of early 20s after a night out drinking, I'd go online and browse the Games Workshop's web store, maybe order off a few things, and a week later they'd arrive and I'd completely forgotten about it, and I would pay enough. And by after a few years uni doing that, I ended up with a small collection again of 40k stuff. But again, that was more just for painting and just kind of nostalgia more than anything. But I was pretty dry when it came to actually playing any games at that point. And then again, a nostalgia wave hit me another kind of 10 years later. In maybe 2013, I was away from work away with work on a course, and I ended up down in Newcastle, and I was taking a wee wander through one of the board gaming shops, because at this point I'd started getting back into board gaming, visited a few board games cafes on holidays, things like that, and I was starting to get into kind of modern board gaming, seeing what was beyond the realms of Monopoly. And obviously a lot of these board game shops still carry a lot of the wargaming stuff as well. So that kind of drew me back into that world a little bit, and I ended up, when I was down in Newcastle, and again after a few drinks, I got bored and ended up buying the latest 40k box set at the time, which I think was like 6th edition Dark Vengeance, which again came with a load of miniatures, and it was a Chaos Cultist that piqued my interest at that time. So I just thought the jump for me from going from the kind of starter sets that just had all the Monopos, Marines and Orcs in them to this new starter set, which seemed to have come with a lot of stuff. You know, it came with, every miniature was different more or less. There was a couple of doublers, but not much. It just looked great. So got that home, ended up buying some cheap craft paints and making a complete mess of the models, and then kind of pushed it all aside and cried for a little bit and couldn't really think what to do next. But my interest was definitely a little bit back into it, and I was just, at that point I didn't know anything about what the current state of affairs was with likes of Epic and things. So did a little bit of research online, found out what had happened with Epic after I'd left it in 3rd edition, and then later into Epic Armageddon, and in the kind of community upkeep of these rulebooks and everything like that. So I was keen to dip my toes back in again, and with the aim of actually getting a game back on as well, and finding someone to play with. So I ended up buying one of the Epic starter sets again, and just started buying miniatures off eBay, stuff I liked, stuff I didn't have as a kid, and things I'd always fancied. Started putting together some armies, and it was just by chance that I was looking at one of the forums, the Tactical Command forum, which is the big one for Epic, and started chatting to folk on there about trying to get a game together and stuff, and then found out that, Gordon, you were in my hometown and happened to play the same niche version of a 25-year-old game that nobody else in the world seemed to be playing, which was quite good luck. So yeah.
Another thing as well is that obviously the internet had developed in those years as well. Like when we were playing Epic at the start, just wouldn't be able to do something like that. So that was a really brilliant, thing to happen actually, because and obviously we became friends because of it. And
my wallet disagrees, but yeah, it's definitely one way to look at it. But yeah, it was total blind luck. It could have been I mean, I'm not one for travelling, and I also was a bit tentative because I've never been a wargamer as such. I would never class myself as that, so it's never been in my nature to, you know, look for older men on the internet to play games with, for want of a better description. But
can I just say as a disclaimer, I wasn't really looking for younger men in the internet.
No, I can do that later. Another topic for another day. But yeah, it was a total stroke of luck, and I was quite kind of glad when we got our games in, because I was really tentative, because like I say, I've never classed myself as a war gamer. I'm definitely a geek and a nerd, or whatever the kids are calling it these days. But it's always put me off slightly when, you know, some of the characters you see at these sort of things, and I was just really worried. But it turns out that, you know,
I was the worst.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Character just had to keep it going. So, but no, it was really good, and it kind of spurred me on to get back into the hobby a bit more than just, you know, buying up a few odd miniatures and painting them up and putting together an army. And a few years later, now I've amassed pretty much a full Epic Space Marine Second Edition collection. Probably about 80% of the models again, which is good, and it's been quite cathartic. So yeah, I've enjoyed that. You know, along that time as well, you also talked me into RPGs, which I'd never been involved with before. Not pen and paper. Played a few on the computer and Xbox and stuff, similar to yourself and the Morrowind games. But yeah, I hadn't really entertained doing a pen and paper one, and I was a little bit tentative about that as well. Again, testament to your GMing and welcoming nature. It was a good group, and we played the Cyberpunk 2020, again set in Glasgow, like you said, and that was great fun. And that kind of whet my appetite a little bit for RPGs, and then obviously later on we jumped into that Star Wars D6 group, which went for a good number of years, and since then played some other systems like the Alien RPG game as well, which has been really good fun. So yeah, it's definitely something I never thought I would ever get into, but kind of timely as well. I think it's obviously having a massive resurgence at the moment. RPG games, tabletop games, just in general, seem to be back in the zeitgeist. So that's good. Aside from that, yeah, like I was saying, board games. I had quite a few. I've got a fairly massive board game collection now as well, and some kind of hybrid games, a bit like Core Space. So I've been playing Imperial Assault and Zombicide, which are kind of miniatures focused board games, and getting folk into that, as well as the X-Wing miniatures game as well, which is a great kind of entryway drug for the hobby, because it's pre-painted minis, simple rules, it's Star Wars, so yeah, it's good fun. And more recently, I've dipped my toe a little bit back into 28mm with bolt action, which kind of scratches a few itches for me of being able to paint nice tanks at a kind of cool scale, and the game itself is really kind of mechanically sound. It's quite abstracted. It's quite simple to play, and you get to shoot Nazis, which is good fun. So yeah, it's been good to get back into that as well. But again, I'm finding myself having to rein myself in a little bit and not go too wild with it, and try to restrict myself to just a few gaming systems at a time. So yeah, Epic's my main wargaming system, and then bolt action as well are the kind of two I'm just focusing on, I think.
Good
yeah,
stuff.
I think it probably brings us up to date with me anyway.
Yep. That brings us in nicely to Chris, who's your cohort for bolt action. So yeah, Chris, what about this?
I think the conversation went something like this in June. You said, I'll not spoil your chat here, but you were saying you and your brother were talking about playing it, and as soon as you said that, I went on and looked at him, and then about a week later,
I think you bought stuff before you did.
Yeah. Anyways, I've got a problem.
Yeah. I don't think our help matters, but anyway.
I think we all have a problem. I think that's why we're here, sharing with the group.
Plastic.
Anyway, Chris, what about yourself? What was your background with wargaming and role playing, and what games have you played as well?
Yeah, I kind of had a similar background to Craig, where I had an older brother, not to play top trumps, but mine's just 16 years older than me. But yeah, he, again, kind of growing up, seeing kind of games that he was playing with his friends and things like that. And I remember one year I got it was like a rip-off of Warhammer 40k from like the Argos catalogue. And he seen it when I got it, and he was like, that's not going to do. And he took me into the Games Workshop. This was like back in, I think it was the early 90s. And we seen the start of this set for Warhammer 40k 2nd edition. He picked that set up, and the two of us kind of started painting it and things like that and playing it. And from there, that was kind of my vice. I'd always been into kind of model making and things like that as a kid with the older fixed kits and things like that. So it was just a natural kind of progression. And from there, we kind of played war games, mostly Warhammer, and then we looked at Dungeons and Dragons after that for a point, because my brother kind of grew up in the golden age for all of that, the kind of early 80s when it was kind of when it first came out, and we kind of picked that up and started going from there as well. So I kind of dipped my toe into that, writing adventures. We kind of took turns at just doing small kind of dungeon crawl kind of adventures and things like that each, and just taking turns at being players or GM, just to kind of share it out. And then we moved on to Warhammer Fantasy after that as well. So it's always kind of been a Games Workshop orientated kind of hobby for myself. With Warhammer Fantasy and the Warhammer Fantasy RPG as well. And then I became a teenager and discovered rock and roll music and drink and all those good things that come with it.
All the things that happen in Glasgow as a teenager.
Yes. I just kind of started drifting away from it as I got a little bit older. Again, my brother was working more and things like that as well, so just kind of never had the time for it, and none of my friends at the time were really into it when I was like a early kind of teenager, so it just kind of frittered away. And again, through my kind of teen years, I got in when I was about 19 or 20. I started going to college. I kind of, similar to Craig, kind of always kind of kept my eye on things, browsed the website every now and again, and thought about getting back into it and talked myself out of it. And yeah, eventually somebody seen me over my shoulder looking at it in college one day and started talking about it. Another friend called Gordon, funnily enough. And he was into 40k as well, and from there I got another starter set and started collecting a Tyrannid army, building that up, and ended up playing in the shop every now and again, every week or so. And it kind of took over my life a wee bit again, as it usually does. So it's always kind of been about the painting side of it for me, because that's kind of what I enjoy in the model making, and just kind of tinkering about, because I've got so many half-built things sitting beside me just now that it always just mounts up. You buy things with good intentions, and so I've always that's always what's kind of drawn me to it, is the artistic kind of side of it, as Craig put it. And again, once I get into uni, workload kind of took over a little bit and never had the time for it, and kind of frittered away again. And that's kind of when I discovered the X-Wing miniatures game and bought that, and was playing it with my partner's little brothers at the time, because they are massive kind of Star Wars fans as well, so I thought that would have been a good way to get back into kind of board gaming and things like that. And my partner Caroline, she worked in A1 comics and toys at the time, so good staff discount and things like that. So it was, started fueling my habit again, and that's when I met you, Gordon, as well. We were talking about that earlier about I think Spellbound games.
Yeah.
Just
which was quite close to where I lived at the time.
Yeah.
And, I think either you posted something about, or I had posted something. One of us had, and
I was like looking for players, basically, if they wanted a game, and one of us answered, and that's when I bumped into you. We played a few games, and that's when you put your feelers out for the role playing game for Star Wars, and that kind of brought me back into that side of things.
At that stage, I knew Craig and his partner. And they were interested in the role playing and Star Wars, so I was kind of trying to find other people that were into Star Wars, because I was interested in running it. So it was a good thing. I met the likes of yourself. I had a couple of my cousins as well. They were interested in playing, so that helped me get a decent number of players that would play regularly. So anyway, sorry, back to you.
That's kind of what brought me back into the kind of role playing side of things. Something I hadn't done for many years, but that kind of ignited that kind of passion for that again. So much so that I ended up looking into running my own kind of system, and that's when the Alien RPG landed. The kind of teaser for it came out, and I was instantly hooked on that, seeing the artwork, and always been a huge fan of the films growing up. Again, brother to blame for that, showing a 6-year-old boy aliens with very harsh language and violence, along with other films such that kind of go hand in hand with that genre, like Terminator and Conan the Barbarian and all sorts. So it's always been a massive influence. Picked up the Alien RPG, got the kind of pre-ordered it and everything, never even thought about it, didn't even know if anyone would be up for playing it. That takes us up to kind of present day, because that's only been the past couple of years, maybe a year and a half since we've been doing that.
Yeah, and you've run a lot of sessions for Alien as well, which is great. I mean, you must be up there amongst the top GMs for Alien worldwide, because you can't, we played most of this year with your homebrew, your own scenarios, so I can't imagine there's too many. I mean, obviously there will be some people that are probably still playing it every week, or maybe even more, but I'd imagine you've definitely put the hours in, so it's been a lot of fun playing that.
As soon as I'd hit the pre-order, I was thinking about a campaign and a storyline for you guys to play. It's been a constant kind of thing, and it became quite obsessive. So I found myself sitting in work writing down storylines and plot ideas and things like that, and not doing my job. I hope my bosses don't listen to this.
I hope not too.
I've got notepads filled with stuff from work that my job, like sometimes I'll be waiting on a model rendering or things like that, and I'll be sitting doing nothing anyway, so I'll just sit and write down ideas and plan plots.
You're just digging yourself a hole here.
I know.
Yeah.
You're writing your own P45, I think.
Aye, well.
You also need to watch out, because that's all their intellectual property now as well, so if it ever gets published,
that's kind of my current RPG up to date. That's kind of where I'm at. I'm planning on continuing our campaign, because we've run, I don't know how many sessions we've run now, it must be up in about 40 odd.
I would have thought so.
Not including the cinematic that we ran first time round, just to get used to the rules and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm planning on taking that back, bringing that back.
Excellent.
Finding out what happens to your characters. And as Craig also mentioned, the old bolt action. That was kind of a lockdown project. When the old corona hit. Thought about maybe just getting a few, maybe just get a couple in kits, a wee bit of infantry, maybe a tank, and that'll be it. We'll just keep it small scale, I said to my brother. And I was like, I know somebody else who might be interested in it. I mentioned to Craig. I was like, yeah, we're thinking of maybe getting into bolt action if you fancy it, because I know me and Craig had spoken about it before. And before you know it, Craig had bought a Churchill tank and God knows what else, a full British battalion. Kind of forced me to get into it a little bit further, and before you know it, I'm on my second army already.
Stop now though, I've bought the last model of Oliver By last week, so that's me.
Right.
Believe you.
Only lying to yourself, Craig.
The missus see the bank statement.
No comment, Craig, no comment.
Separate accounts for that, definitely.
One other game I've not mentioned is Space Hulk. That was one of the ones I picked up more for the modelling side of things and painting. Picked up the third edition because I was kind of falling away from Warhammer at the time and then by the time I got round to want to play it, it was kind of out of print, difficult to get, and GW announced the third edition, so again bought that for the models and the painting, and it turned out it was actually great fun to play, and it's kind of kept me hooked ever since. I've always brought it out every now and again to play the odd mission or running through the campaign with you, Gordon, as well, before we were all in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of everything up to date for me, I think.
Excellent. And last but not least, we've got Bob, and I think it's fair to say myself, Craig and Chris have kind of similar background stories about how we get into gaming, but for Bob, I think it's a bit different. So yeah, Bob, what about yourself? How did you get into role-playing and wargaming? And
Yeah, like you say, Gordon, it was a pretty different story for me. I was kind of lucky or unluckily, I don't know, to grow up in a house where there was always some kind of computer from the earliest age. Like, we had a Vertrex in the house. You probably don't even know what that is, because it was, and to be honest, it wasn't great. It wasn't really worth knowing what that was. But after going through, I suppose, the age that I had those systems like the Vertrex, Commodore 64 and the Atari ST, it wasn't really, I was only like 4 or 5 years old when we had that kind of thing. But for me, growing up, things really started to make sense to me by the time we got a kind of DOS computer, like 486. And, my kind of thing that I grew up with was like Dark Forces 2, like Star Wars, and like the X-Wing games on the PC, kind of followed by Star Wars Rebellion, or was actually called Supremacy in the UK, which really went into a lot of the lore of the expanded universe of Star Wars, and it was a massive. It was probably my favourite film as a child as well. So having that kind of extra material really brought it to life for me, and there was just so many extra stories and actual, especially with as time went on, I would say the RPG elements in these games got greater, because with Dark Forces 2 moved on to sort of Jedi Outcast and Jedi Academy, where you had more story, but also your character developed as you went along, which kind of culminated in KOTOR, which was Knights of the Old Republic, which was it's an interesting one because it's actually based on the Star Wars D20 tabletop game.
Right.
But this was the kind of actual rules of it are based on the mechanics of the tabletop RPG, as far as I'm aware. But kind of coming from all of this background, was Star Wars was a really big thing for me when I was growing up. And in terms of role playing, after that there were some other games like the Elder Scrolls, like Morrowind and Oblivion, which were a kind of big part for me in my childhood as well, which are much more heavily. Those two games, along with KOTOR, are much more heavily RPG influenced than the other ones that I mentioned, and as time went on with that, I suppose when I got older, with me, I was always trying to get my friends into PC games, but was actually friends with Chris when I was growing up, and he got me to play a bit of sort of Warhammer and things like that. So I'd had some exposure to tabletop gaming through him, and I was never that big on the model building. I did do Airfix when I was younger, but kind of fell away after a couple of years. But with sort of late high school, kind of did some wargaming and things like that, and there was a bit of a gap really after that, university and work and things like that. And it was Chris that invited me to come along to your Star Wars game, which for me was like a more social version of playing the PC kind of game, if that makes sense. And I was super into the kind of backstory of all of that stuff, so to be able to go and play that in a group was quite a fun thing for me. So we did that for I think over a year or so. That we played Star Wars.
The other thing, just kind of tying back to what you were saying earlier on about it's the EU, was that I'm guessing that might have been interesting for you, the D6 system, because the D6 system actually, essentially after the Return of the Jedi had come out, there was literally nothing for Star Wars for a few years, and the first thing that came out was the Star Wars role-playing game. And the Star Wars role-playing game, they essentially, it must have been like a dream come true for those guys, because they get access to Lucasfilm's, as far as I understand it, they get access to Lucasfilm's archives, and essentially everything that they created in the game became lore, a lot of it. Like, for example, the Quarren species, they were initially just called, like the Star Wars figure called them Squidhead. They didn't have a species name. So it was like a lot of the species were all kind of came out of the Star Wars role-playing game, and quite a lot of other stuff as well. So I'm guessing that might have been interesting for you, kind of coming full circle with the EU and finding out where some of that stuff, there probably would have been stuff in those games which would have came from that version of Star Wars as well. And then it was in the 90s later on that, in fact, the next kind of big thing, there was the Timothy Zahn books, which I'm guessing probably most of us have read, which when he was given the job to do that, they said read these role playing games, and he was quite, as far as I understand, he wasn't very impressed about this, and was told. But when he actually started looking through the materials, he did find it useful, and it gave him more of an understanding of the Star Wars universe. So, in some way that you've kind of brought you back to your interest in the Star Wars EU, and that would have been, that was part of the building blocks, that particular version of Star Wars role playing.
Yeah, I mean, playing the role playing game with you was your kind of homebrew story, but it was all very familiar. I found it all very familiar, and it was an easy way for me to move to try something new, because it was so similar to KOTOR, I would say, to Knights of the Old Republic in some ways, but also having the background of playing all the older Star Wars games. It felt quite natural to play, and that was the first kind of face-to-face role-playing game that I'd played. And from there, I think eventually we'd kind of reached a natural conclusion with the Star Wars role-playing game the campaign we were playing, which had gone on for over a year. I think it was at that point that I kind of took up X-Wing, because we were doing that for a bit of a change, and that was the actual kind of war game X-Wing on tabletop with the models. And for me, I'm not very good at painting, so it was nice that they came sort of pre-done.
Yeah, that was a major selling point for me as well, because I've never really enjoyed the painting side of the hobby particularly. I've always found that I just don't feel I can do it justice. So I was absolutely delighted when I saw it. I thought, wow, what a way to get people into wargaming, give them actually miniatures which are assembled and fully painted. I mean, so yeah, I can understand the attraction there. Sorry, on you go.
Yeah, no, that was, well, you're right, that was a kind of an easy way in for me, because I'm sure Chris had tried to sort of twist my arm with 40k and stuff in the past, but I was never, like I said, I was never that much into painting models, so for me the X-Wing was more interesting, but I suppose it also had the attraction that I was into the sort of story and things like that behind it, so it was, it inherently had more interest for me. So I mean, I think we went through a period where we played that a lot, sometimes alongside our the Star Wars RPG. I think we'd started that before we sort of finished off the Star Wars campaign, but certainly at some point after that, I'd actually run Cyberpunk for a period. I think it was maybe about a dozen sessions or something like that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was great for me to get playing Cyberpunk. Anytime I've done it in the past, it was always as GM, so it was really nice for me to get on the other side of the screen and just see what you came up with, which was a lot of fun. And yeah, I enjoyed that. I don't know if I felt like I took the lead from that player I was talking about earlier on, but he had really interacted with the setting, and I tried to do similar things, and engage with it as much as I possibly can. So I don't know if that came across or not, but certainly I was keen.
You were a keen player, yeah. I mean, I remember from doing that, I took a lot of inspiration from games like System Shock too, and also like Deus Ex, and which was a kind of a cyberpunk RPG from PC gaming, like in the year 2000. So like for me, that was another kind of interesting. I was still thinking of it in terms of like PC games that I'd played in the past. But it was the first time I had actually ran a game, like for a group, so that was interesting. I think after that, I think the Alien RPG was the next thing. Well, we did actually. I took part in Dread for a while, Judge Dredd, that you ran.
We did do a couple of sessions, but Dread's one of those ones that's a wee bit hard if you don't. I think part of the problem with it was that the group wasn't as familiar with the source material, and I think it's one of those games that you can get a lot more out of when you know a bit about it. the film, neither film really kind of captured Dread properly, if that makes sense. If you put the two of them together, you probably get an approximation of it. The Carl Urban version was much more true to the judges and how Dread is as a character, but it didn't have the look of Mega City 1, and the Stallone one was perfect. That's exactly what it was supposed to look like. And I would say that the tone, the supposed humour in the Stallone one didn't work, and then the Carl Urban one didn't have any humour really. A few kind of dry lines in it, but didn't really have it. And Dread's got that humour in it as well, and kind of satire. But it's a difficult one when you haven't really read the comics to get people into it. I wasn't. Part of the problem was I wasn't feeling as engaged. I was kind of having some problems with the system that I was running at that particular time, and that made it difficult. But yeah, we did do that briefly, and then we moved on to Chris's Alien RPG. How did you find? How did you find doing that, Bob?
That was Alien's an interesting RPG because I think when you're playing a role-playing game, like a tabletop sort of paper and pen role-playing game, you're kind of, if you take like Star Wars or Judge Dredd as a kind of an example, maybe you'll disagree, but my kind of understanding is that there's a bit of a kind of a social contract with it, that like when you play as a team, you're sort of accepting that you're all on the same side and you'll kind of work together, whereas Alien has like a built-in kind of conflict to it, which is to me is different from other RPG games, where everyone has their kind of own agenda, and so like not everybody's necessarily on the same side, which is to me is kind of that's unique to Alien, I think, well, as far as I'm aware anyway.
Yeah.
And I did really enjoy Alien because I was always a massive fan of the first two movies growing up, and it was fun to kind of to relive that, and like in the RPG. And Chris and I went to school together, and like we often played like Aliens versus Predator 2 on the PC and stuff like that. And, so like for me it was reminiscent of many nights
mornings.
On the Survivor map for quarantine, and it reminded me of that as well as the movie and things. But once, I mean, the main thing that stands out about it is it's a stressful game to play, and even you can't really trust anybody either.
I don't know what you mean by that, Bob.
I think franchise justice though with that.
Yeah, totally.
We'll maybe talk about that when we talk about the Alien RPG specifically. We can get into some of that.
Yeah, but really, I mean, that franchise and the RPGs are an interesting one for sure. And I think really maybe not quite the last thing I did, but when Chris took like a hiatus or a break from running Alien, I'd ran the kind of cinematic adventure for Alien, the new one, based on Hadley's Hope.
That's right. It was in Roll20, and you were using the
shot, which I think actually worked out to be maybe 2 sessions.
Yeah. You did that in Roll20, didn't you?
Yeah, that was during quarantine on Roll20, and
it feels like so long ago now.
Yeah, I mean, it might have been possibly 6 months ago now. I can't remember exactly when we did that, but I can remember it was on Roll20, that was quite interesting, different to GM that game compared to Cyberpunk. Although both are similarly brutal in some ways.
I think being a player on that, Bob, like from me, made maybe a kind of GM after
that. Really, Chris?
Yeah, I thought.
I killed as many of these after that.
I don't know. I think we need to consult the stats on that one.
You mean after you insta died in Cyberpunk, or after the Alien? After the Alien, yeah, it's pretty brutal, man. Like
things just go south so quickly. But anyway, as Gordon said, we'll get into
for
that.
me. I mean, that tied in, so running Alien, I mean, all of my kind of tabletop experiences really relate back to my primary thing that I like, which is the PC. And even with running the Alien RPG at the end, for me, that, like, when I was younger, I messed around with, like, the Unreal Engine and stuff like that, and when I ran Alien, kind of took a different take on it from Chris and when Gordon ran Star Wars and stuff, and I was sort of messing around with dynamic lighting, and for me it was as much about building the map on Roll20 as it was about, I mean, obviously I had a pre-made story, so I didn't have to worry about that side of it so much, whereas those guys were always doing sort of homebrew adventures.
But you did homebrew for Cyberpunk though, so I wouldn't, you definitely have done it, so.
Oh yeah, completely. But I don't think I did so much of the map work when I'd had to put the work in for the story as well for Cyberpunk. But in that last game that I ran, it was kind of a lot of work went into just essentially it was like. The map was dynamically lit on Roll20, so I'd kind of set all of that up, and I know you guys kind of found that like more scary, maybe.
Yeah, it was really immersive. It was almost like playing a computer game at times. It's just I guess it's just really interesting because it's another aspect to the wider hobby that you don't necessarily think about as being an option, but I guess as more games have went on to Roll20 in recent times, it kind of does present itself as one way of getting some enjoyment out of it. I guess it's the equivalent of model painting or the kind of meta hobby, not just playing the games, but whatever else you do around the game to
kind of building the world.
Yeah, world building, whether it's writing stories or whether it's painting miniatures or building miniatures or making terrain or doing the stuff in Roll20, writing macros and designing character sheets. So there's so many kind of bits to it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, well, you kind of end up building your own kind of world, and I think to summarise the thing that kind of that I liked about tabletop role-playing games was, especially when you got to either build or contribute to your own kind of collective world that you'd came up with, with the group. And on the last point of Alien, like doing the map was really enjoyable because it's like you've literally built like a world for your friends to explore. If you know what I mean? In a horrible, in a kind of horrible way, like
horrible death trap for your friends.
Yeah.
Isn't that the best kind?
I guess that's what Jigsaw in the Saw movies thought he was doing as well.
Yeah, not sure I'm on the same level, but yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know, I suppose you're kind of
in you for that.
What, sorry?
I think you need to be a little bit of a psychopath to GM Alien.
It's very punitive, yeah, like, but I think, yeah, it was, essentially what I'm trying to say is, the interesting thing about role-playing and also PC games. It was all for me about that you got to, because the games I was always attracted to were ones that you got to kind of choose the direction of the story. So it made it feel like more like a immersive simulation. And it's kind of the same with tabletop gaming. Like if you contribute in some way, like with Star Wars. One last thing, like before I kind of finish up, when we were playing the Star Wars game, I'd kind of talked to Gordon in the background, and was kind of the backstory of my character was like he was an Imperial agent in the rebellion, kind of thing, and it's just having that kind of building up like a kind of story that your friends are a part of. That's what I find interesting about it and what enjoyable. But yeah, that's pretty much my piece on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that about role playing. I think, yeah, building that story and being able to interact with things is part of the thing that's really interesting, and you get to do it with friends. Yeah, I think there's a few things we can pick up on the next discussion. We can talk about what we like about role playing and wargaming. I think specifically there as well, Bob, one of the things that you've just made kind of pinged in my head was when you were talking about role playing, about when we play face to face and when we play online in Roll20. I think that's worthy of discussion. About the differences between the two, and I actually think there's pros and cons to both. I know that I don't think I would ever have thought this before the pandemic, really, but I do think it's kind of equal. I can quite happily game face to face, but I quite happily do it online now, and it's still really enjoyable. I do miss seeing everybody's faces around the table. I think that's the one thing that you really lose.
That's what I was just going to say, Gordon, is I miss seeing people's reactions.
Yeah,
Especially with something like Alien, where there are quite shock moments and things like that happening, and backstabbing and people working against the team and all that. You miss kind of seeing the sort of the sparks fly.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Because like when we'd started playing Alien, it was before lockdown, and then we got a few sessions in face to face before everything gets shut down. So we had to kind of think on our feet and try and get it back up and running.
Yeah.
But that's maybe one for another day.
Definitely. So I think we'll wrap it up there, and just thanks everybody for telling their stories, because that was good. It was interesting. There's stuff I didn't know there myself, even though I've known you for years. So thanks very much for the discussion, and yeah, we'll have another one soon, and we'll maybe talk in general terms about wargaming and role playing, but there will be more podcasts coming where we do talk about some of the specific games that we've mentioned tonight, and various different people will be contributing to them. So yeah, hope you enjoyed our first session, and that you come back and listen for more. And yeah, please follow us wherever this gets posted up, whether it's on YouTube or on iTunes or whatever. Craig, you can maybe step in there and tell me the
yeah, we need to work that out, but yeah,
it'll be somewhere in the net.
Wherever podcasts are, we'll be there.
Anyway, thanks very much, guys, and thanks to you for listening, and yeah, we'll speak to you soon. Thanks, and bye-bye.
Bye. Cheers.